Well, it's a pleasure today to welcome you all here to what is our second Erskine Fellow Prestige Lecture for 2019. And today it's going to be given by Professor Ian Coulter. And Ian is an alumni of this university, and he's been remissing with both what he had and I had in terms of Bruce Jameson as his lecturer, who was a lecturer in psychology when we were both students here, so it was nice to be reacquainted with Bruce again this evening. Ian is now a senior health policy researcher at the RAND Corporation in the USA, where he was the holder of the RAND Samueli Chair in Integrative Medicine from 2007 until January 2018. He is a professor in the School of Dentistry at UCLA in a division of Public Health and Community Dentistry, where he teaches general ethics, research ethics, and evidence-based dentistry. A professor at Pardee Rand Graduate School and a research professor at the Southern California University of Health Sciences. Professor Coulter has more than 40 years' experience in conducting both qualitative and quantitative research in complementary alternative medicine and integrative medicine, and has published over 150 articles and books. Wow. And has recent NIH grants that include Evidence-Based Practices Program and CAM, evaluation of hospital-based integrative medicine, and the context effects on the health encounter. He also holds grants from the Department of Defence in the USA to conduct comparative effectiveness trials on chiropractic in military facilities, and an evaluation of the creation, implementation and evaluation of health policies and health affairs. I asked Ian today to be provocative and to be a provocateur, and he's willing to do that, which is no surprise. And he's, as you can see from the slide, is going to talk today about the professional ethical responsibilities of the consumer of science, lessons from the opioid crisis. In New Zealand, the opioid crisis hasn't quite reached us here to the same magnitude it has in the USA, but certainly trends are in that direction. So the message that Ian will send to us today is a very important one for us to hear, and maybe we can learn some lessons from the American context. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Ian. Thanks.
Kia ora. I hope this is working. I don't hear it, but anyway. This was going to be fairly intimidating anyway, but not only did Bruce Jameson teach me, he was my master's supervisor for my MA here. So I'm hoping he's forgotten what the thesis was about or whether it was any good. But anyway, what I need to do first is to actually make a disclaimer to tell you that I don't receive funding from any of the drug companies I'll mention today. I never have received funding from them, and with any luck, I never will. And after today's presentation, I can guarantee they will never give me any funding. So anyway, it's a standard disclaimer we make, but I have no financial interest in any of the drugs that I'm going to talk about. And then I should say that John Diefenbaker, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, used to say that when he gave a presentation, he would first of all tell people what he was going to say, and then he would say it, and then he would tell people what he said. And I've always thought that's pretty good advice, so that's what I will do today as well. I'll give you an outline of what I intend to talk about. And it turns out that in health field at the moment, we live in an era where we are sort of teaching, and we're trying to convince people who practice that we live in the world of evidence-based practice. And so that's the kind of world that we're in. And those who are in practice and those who teach it, like myself, I'm going to suggest you have some ethical responsibilities that are not generally discussed and not usually acknowledged, and we tend not to focus on those ethical responsibilities. Everybody has worked out the ethical responsibilities of the drug companies. In fact, the total lack of ethical behaviour of the drug companies, I suppose, is a better way of saying that. And they're getting a lot of the blame for this kind of crisis. But I will suggest to you that there is another part of this crisis you need to think about, and it has to do with those who consume science. And I've taught ethics for about, 35, 40 years, long time. And it's only in the last 2 years that I've ever taught anything about the consumers of science. I train researchers in ethics, I train dentists in ethics, I train medical doctors in ethics, I actually train the pain physicians in America in ethics, but never have I actually given a presentation to them on what it means to be a consumer of science and what your ethical responsibilities are. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. Those who consume science have some ethical responsibilities as well, and they have actually contributed, I think, to the opioid crisis. Now, the ethical standards for scientists are actually pretty well understood, both by scientists and also by journals. Journals won't publish an article now, a research article, unless you can show them. You've got to declare that it's gone through an IRB, which is an ethical review board. And now it's even worse. They demand to have a letter from the IRB. The top journals now won't even take your word for it. And so they know what the ethical responsibilities are for the researcher, and every researcher knows that. They're all trained in it. And then we forgot about the group that translates science, which is teachers like myself and teachers like many of you, but also those who practice clinically. We forgot entirely about their responsibility here as well. The buzzword in America at the moment is called translational science, which is this whole move to try and make sure if you're going to have evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine, you've got to translate science into practice. And so you can't get a grant from the NIH now in America unless as part of that grant you spell out what are you going to do with translational science at the end of it. You've got to explain about how your research will translate into practice or into some kind of policy or whatever. So the opioid crisis is a terrible tragedy, there's no question about that, but it does actually provide an opportunity for us to reconsider the whole ethical responsibilities around this crisis. And it does involve looking at the ethical responsibility of those, I said, that consume science. And what I want to show to you today is what are the consequences that we get when we don't do it, when we don't pay attention to that ethical responsibility. What are the consequences for not doing that? So if you look at America, at the moment, right up to 2018, about 115 people a day die from overdose on opioids. And between 1999 to 2015, 183,000 died from prescriptions. So it's not just illegal opioids that are killing people, it's actually prescription opioids as well. And so if you look at the opioid overdoses in 2016, which was 42,000 deaths, over 40% of those were from a prescription. So the prescription part is a huge part. In fact, it's probably about 68% now, as I'll point out in a moment. And the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention in the United States have actually estimated that the cost to America at the moment is probably around $78 billion a year. And that's in terms of people dying and health care and lost productivity, treating addiction and so on, and even criminal involvement as well. And that figure, although it's bad enough, it doesn't even touch on the human tragedy that's involved in this, because this is unbelievably dramatic in terms of its consequences for families and for all kinds of people that are impacted by it. Here's what it looks like. You can see it's been pretty steady since 1999. Men and women are not a lot different in America in terms of this. The overdose by the time you got to 2017 is 70,000, by the way, of which 47, I think, opioid ones, and also most of those are prescription. Now, it would be wonderful to pretend that this crisis snuck up on us and we didn't see it coming. That actually isn't true. If you look at the data from the CDC, you go back to 2000, and you look at the two graphs at the top, you can see we were tracking this pretty well. we were actually obsessed about the bottom one. We're huge concern about heroin. It turns out heroin was the least of our problems compared to the other two. I don't mean to imply that heroin's not a problem. It sure is. But it wasn't the one that we really should have been paying attention to, and it was the one that we really did pay attention to, and we sort of forgot about the other two. We weren't paying attention to them. So it didn't sneak up on us. We knew the data was there. We could have tracked it. We should have known it was happening. So if you want to know how New Zealand does, that's New Zealand there, that blue line. You can only do this on per capita, so it's one area where we're quite happy that Australia is beating us. And you notice we've got peaks and valleys in New Zealand, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure what the explanation for that is, but the thing you need to see is the trend is the same, that we're trending the same way as other nations. And even then, if you think where we are compared to the others, there's not that many that are above us. So it is a major problem. If you look at the data that's been put together, it's hard to get good data about the death rates in New Zealand. I'm not sure why that is, whether they just don't disconnect them from other death rates, but I was having a hard time finding it. But down the bottom there is the one that you want to look at, that in 2015 was around 37 deaths a year. I can't find data for 2018, but since it's trending up, it's probably gone up. But if you look at the top one, you can see that we have been going up, right? And if you look at 16.7 per 1,000 people are getting strong opioids, and of course, they're the most likely to become addicted and the most likely to overdose, right? And there's a twofold variation between district health boards. Again, it's not all the piece in New Zealand, there's some variation. This is kind of interesting that it's people that identify as European or other ethnicity get it 2 to 5 times more than others. But this is the one that's kind of interesting to me, and I'll show the ones for America as well. 11% of people age 80 plus are in that group as well. Now you could say they're also more likely to be the terminally ill ones, so there might be a sort of medical explanation for that, but it is kind of worrisome that they would be in that group. In New Zealand, women are actually more likely to get strong opioids than men. In America, men are dying slightly more percentage-wise than women, but not by much, right? And then of the strong opioids, you can see that 12 took opioid for 6 or more weeks, which again, the longer you take the stuff, the much more likely you are to get addicted on it. And so you can see that, so the trend in New Zealand is the same. The stats that are starting to appear look just as worrisome, it seems to me, on a scale somewhat less than America, but still it doesn't look like it's going to be a lot better. But this is the most recent thing that's come out, which strikes me as very puzzling. Gabapentin has been shown now in England and Canada and America to be implicated in 30% of all fatal overdoses. 30%. That's staggering. It's a very recent drug, by the way. It was developed, well, it's a recent drug for giving it to people on opioids. It was developed for epilepsy originally, and then it became an what's the word I want? Off-label drug for treating nerve pain, and now it's been treated for general pain. But if you look at it in New Zealand, the increase that's happening in New Zealand is amazing. From 2013, if you look, it virtually doubled in prescription. And for some reason, which totally inexplicable to me, but some of you might know why, Pharmac last year took it off regulation. So now it can be prescribed for any condition in New Zealand and can be prescribed by any MD without having regulation. Who knows why? It seems kind of strange at the very time we're getting data from overseas about how deadly this drug is with opioids, that we'd be the one country that stops regulating it. Now, if someone knows why that's the case, please tell me. I can't find any explanation.
Pressure and lobbying.
Well, that's what I would guess. But I've got to see the data for that. In America, I'd know it'd be the drug company, yeah.
It is still a scam.
Conditions like complex regional pain syndrome, gabapentin is really helpful in helping sort those conditions.
Yeah. Oh, there's no doubt. I talked to a nurse the other day, and she said on her ward, it's now the pain medication of choice. So we know that that's what it's been using. But if you're giving it to people that also have got opioids, then that's when it's deadly, right? So I told you 30%, so that's fine.
Pharmac does deals with
Yeah.
the drug companies to maintain or to keep within its pharmaceutical budget. It will say to a drug company, if you give us this a bit cheaper, we will get your other product.
Oh.
And it may have been a deal that they
Could be
did.
a deal.
If we take this off, then the drug company will come in with some other product. So these sorts of things go on behind the scenes.
Anyway, it would seem to worrisome, whatever
Yeah,
the reason
sure.
is. There's no good news about the opioid crisis that I can give you, but this is the thing that comes closest to it, that at least for prescription drugs, for at least 2016 to 2017, we're actually seeing it fall off. So it may be that in terms of prescribed opioids in America anyway, we might have started to change physician behaviour. So that's the only good news. But as I said, 70,000 people still died in 2017 from overdoses, right? So it's still not that good. How did it happen? Well, it came in 3 waves. The first wave was oxycodone, which I think here is called oxycodone, but it's the same drug. Purdue was the company in the United States that developed it. Then it went to heroin. It turned out after a while, heroin could be purchased on the street. You could get it easier than you could get oxycodone, not at the beginning. So oxycodone was the one, and it was prescribed, of course, largely. And now it's fentanyl. And fentanyl is turning out to be a total disaster. And it's only begun to surge in 2013. And so for the next 3 years, the fatal overdoses doubled each year for fentanyl. We're starting to see the reckoning. The company, the big one is Purdue, in the United States had to pay out $270 million in a out-of-court settlement 2 weeks ago in, I think it's Oklahoma. Having paid out once, of course, in the United States, this really drastically increases your liability because now you've kind of admitted, and particularly an out-of-court settlement. But the feeling is that what Purdue will probably do is declare bankruptcy, and it probably will avoid. And as I said before, go back here, the number of other lawsuits in the United States is 1,600. There's a huge number of lawsuits by states, by counties, by native tribes, by everybody. I mean, they're queuing up now to sue this company and other companies as well. Purdue wasn't the only one, but it was the one that really started it. And it really launched it, I think it was 97, around 97, 99. And so the actual crisis almost coincides with them actually doing this. So if again, to sum up the sort of data I'm giving you, nearly 400,000 people in the United States died during the period that they were actually selling. I'm not saying they were guilty for all that, but they certainly contributed in a big way to it. And you look at, there's a record of 47,000 in 2017. That's the population of Timaru. Now, people who are in the audience from Timaru will know that I have a moral obligation to mention Timaru at least once in every presentation I give in New Zealand. I wish I had a better time to present them, but anyway, that would have wiped out the whole of Timaru, which would have been a staggering loss, I can assure you. Anyway, Purdue's sort of highly blamed for 2 things. First of all, they said it wasn't addictive, and 2, they lied about the effect sizes. It turns out that oxycodone for chronic pain is not that effective, because what happens in a very short time is people get addicted, and it doesn't control pain. So they lied about 2 things, how good it was as a pain control, and also they lied about it being addictive. And not only that, but the gall of this company, and by the way, it was started by 2 physicians. The family made a mint of money out of it, but anyway, I mean, talk about the gall. Because read the bottom one. This is from one of their planning documents that's now in front of the court. They said there's an opportunity to expand offering as an end-to-end pain provider. On the one hand, will cause the addiction, on the other will treat it. And I'm going to give a nice quote to Bruce Davison, who said, "This gives another dimension to vertical integration in the healthcare field." I mean, this is unbelievable. That's also in front of the court. So they actually now started selling drugs to treat the addiction itself, having caused it to begin with. So there's nothing modest about their ambition. So again, if you look at what's happened, I said it, I mean, the final thing, if you look at those 70,000 at the moment that it's drug overdoses, it's 67% of them from that. But fentanyl is kind of interesting, and even if you look at the data in America, the increases per year are quite staggering, actually. From 2016 to 2017, the overdose deaths went up 12% overall. I told you men and women about the same. But look at this one here. People 65 and older experience the largest increase. Now, we can think of why that might be the case sociologically or psychologically, but again, it's hard to imagine that the 65 people are the ones that are getting the most addiction, but they had the largest increase. But some of the other ones are kind of interesting. One of them is worse, is a little town in West Virginia that has the highest death rate in the United States, and it turned out they had a GP or one or two GPs that were giving them out like candy. But here's this amazing one, is Utah. For those who don't know, Utah is the Mormon state in America, and Mormon religious belief system has a whole bunch of practices that are very health enhancing. Don't drink caffeine, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke. There's a whole bunch of belief systems that generally mean that they are in pretty good health. So for them to be, I think, the third or fourth in the rate of increase is kind of staggering. So you can see that there's tremendous variation, but it does occur across the whole of the United States. There's no one that's immune to it. And as Peter's pointed out, that one of the things you need to know here is that drugs are much more harmful and much less effective than most medical doctors are aware, and it's now the 13th lead cause of death. So only heart disease and cancer, which means that it has now overtaken accidents for killing people in the United States. So we're talking about a huge problem. And what really was a sort of medically induced problem in a way, that's the stagnant part about it. Well, what's the ethical dilemma here? Well, it's kind of staggering that this happened when it happened, because this is the age in which we introduced evidence-based medicine and what we call evidence-based practice. So it's not just medical doctors who are trained in evidence-based practice. It's nurses, it's doctors, it's pharmacists, it's dentists, anyone who practices, it's chiropractors, it's naturopaths, all now educated in this paradigm called evidence-based practice. And it's hard to see why people who were trained and educated during the same period could actually be writing prescriptions for something with adverse events as bad as this, right? And when there's virtually no evidence for it. Very little evidence. So how did that happen? So that's the sort of, as an ethicist, that's the kind of dilemma that I'm interested in, and I'm sort of trying to look at. And what happened in the 1990s, of course, is the pharmaceutical companies did lie, and they did reassure the medical community that they wouldn't become addicted, that you could write this prescription. And that certainly did help lead to this abuse. But it wasn't the only thing that happened. The other thing that happened is kind of interesting. There was an opinion published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It wasn't an article. It didn't report on the study. There was no stats. It was an opinion written by two scientists, Porter and Schick, who actually said they'd done the study in the hospital, and they said that, in actual fact, that there are only 4 cases of reasonably well-documented addiction in patients who had no history of addiction, and if you look away the take-home measures, they conclude that despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospital, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. It was absolutely wrong. I mean, you couldn't have been more wrong, actually, when you think what happened afterwards. But it's in the New England Journal of Medicine. For those of you who don't know, the New England Journal of Medicine is the most prestigious journal in America. It's the hardest one by far to get anything published in it. Very difficult, and it's probably one of the most respected one. And it's considered be the premier, better than JAMA actually. And so when they put this in their journal, what happened in the 90s is that we got into a situation where I'll tell you become ethically ambivalent, and I'll explain what I mean by that at the moment. But the truth is, the easy answer to the cause of this crisis is that it wasn't evidence-based. Had it been evidence-based, it probably never would have happened, right? But it wasn't evidence-based. But the amazing thing is that this is the era in which evidence-based medicine became the dominant paradigm for educating physicians. It's probably the case that virtually every physician in America anyway, during this period, was educated in evidence-based medicine. It would have been very difficult to avoid it because it became the mantra. And it coincides with the crisis almost exactly. So it's a cautionary tale for this whole thing about how well do you transfer science into practice. It certainly sort of questions whether this translational science is working too well, right? And so the new drugs, I mean, it's almost what you call a perfect storm. The new drugs emerged at a time where they were saying they weren't addictive, and they were actually claiming they were effective. And it also emerged at a time when ethicists started to be critical about the treatment of pain in medicine. And it turned out that up until this period, medicine in the United States was very obsessed about not getting patients addicted, to the point where they wouldn't give opioids to even terminally ill patients. So people in excruciating pain were not being treated for pain, they were being left alone. And a lot of ethicists started to question that and started to say that one of the ethical responsibilities of a physician is to treat pain. It isn't to let people suffer. And if people are going to die, you'd wonder, well, addiction's got to be the least of your problem, right? Going to the grave addicted isn't going to be a great loss to you personally, and probably not to anyone else. So when this appeared in this ambivalent climate, and now the claim is they're not addictive, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what happened. But in actual fact, there were two quite contrary opinions. This article here actually argued, if you look at it, whether there was a real... Sorry, I've got the wrong one. No, this is the one that said that they should have been looking at this ethically. And two failures. Not only did medicine not raise this question, bioethicists were silent about it as well. So this sort of situation had developed where people were not being treated for pain. The ethicists were quiet about it. They said very little about it. And of course, medicine wasn't talking about it either. But they developed two absolute contrary opinions. The first one is this one up here. And they questioned whether a patient actually had a right to have their pain treated with opioids, or actually have their pain treated, technically, as a fundamental ethical right. And then the other group said absolutely, that the relief of pain and avoidance of suffering is an ethical duty that's placed upon all physicians. So you've got these two kind of opinions happening in the 90s, competing with each other, and again, the law was no help. Because what happened in case law, depending where you went to court, doctors got sued for addicting people, even if they're terminally ill, and they got sued for not treating them with opioids for pain. So the medical profession was caught in a bit of a bind here, because they were damned if they did and they were damned if they didn't. And then into that comes this perfect storm with the drug companies saying, well, we have now got the perfect drug for you, so now you can treat pain and they're not going to get addicted, right? So it was a really tricky situation. As I said, the fact that they coincided was a bit of a problem. The AMA sort of sat on the fence, as they quite often do. They sort of said, yeah, there is an obligation to treat pain, but look at this one here. But they weren't sure how far that ethical obligation went. They wouldn't say that you could be prosecuted for being unethical, and they didn't say you should report people who don't know how to manage pain because it's unethical, which you would do on other areas. If someone was doing plastic surgery and they weren't trained to do it, you have an ethical obligation as a physician to report it, right? So they're pretty clear on other obligations when you're supposed to report on somebody and when someone's being unethical. On this one, they sort of fudged it. They weren't quite sure about it. And so again, it didn't help the physicians very much. How did we get to this situation? Well, in America, we've had this obsession about drugs. There's a drug culture. We have this whole set of cultural beliefs. I think it was Nancy Reagan started the war on drugs. I think it coincided with her. And so we had a situation where this thing about getting people addicted became a bit of an obsession, and doctors were trying to avoid it like the plague, if I can use that expression. And there's a few things that went with that. First of all, they wouldn't give it if they could help it. Secondly, they had inadequate knowledge. It turned out that very few physicians were well trained in pain management. It's now become a specialty, and you know the anaesthetists in America tend to be the pain interventionist guys, are the big ones. I teach them ethics too, actually. But anyway, there was a very small group of people, and the average GP was not well educated about pain management, particularly not for terminally ill and so on. And then the other thing that happened was quite peculiar, is that pain wasn't seen as a priority in this kind of medical paradigm. I don't know how to express this very well, but basically they say, of course you've got pain, you're sick. So the attack was to cure the pathology or the disease, or to take care of the trauma, and the pain would take care of itself. So pain came to be seen as sort of an epiphenomenon in this kind of paradigm. And even worse, they developed this attitude that you're supposed to be stoical about it. And so patients were sort of expected to suck up the pain and say, of course you've got pain, you're ill, but we'll take care of the illness and the pain will go away. So they didn't see pain as a fundamental priority. What happened, of course, with the new ethics is that pain became the target of attack, if you like, irrespective of what the actual illness and that was. And the last one that didn't help, of course, was the difficulty of diagnosis. If you want to be a malingerer, the best thing to invent is back pain. Now, I've suffered from back pain. I've had extensive surgery, so believe me, I didn't make it up. Everyone who's suffering back pain, believe me, I know you've got really pain. But if you didn't, and you want to pretend to have it, it's the one to choose. There's no definitive diagnosis for back pain. It's very difficult to diagnose, and that's true for a lot of pain syndromes. So that's why what happened, in fact, in America, which is kind of sad, is you've got the marginalization of chronic pain, and chronic pain sufferers are a big group in the opioid crisis. Because they're the ones who've had it so long, then they overdose and they commit suicide and a whole bunch of things. And virtually what happened was they came to be seen, what's the word in New Zealand? Whinges, is that the expression in New Zealand? Whinges, yeah. You know, like they moan too much about their condition. So all these things were happening culturally, and again, as I'm trying to get across to you, created really the situation for a perfect storm. The drug companies were bad, the ethicists were now raising this issue, there was a whole set of cultural, social belief systems that had sort of affected the practice of medicine, and into this world came this addiction, right? What I'm going to suggest to you here, though, is that if we'd thought about the ethical requirements at the moment for those who consume science, I'm not saying the crisis wouldn't have occurred, but it may have been a lot less. And as I said, it's kind of interesting to me as an ethicist that we've always understood the ethical requirements of the scientist. We know that. We even know what it is for journals. We know that. And we never really paid much attention to these. And the average practitioner is not a scientist. They're not trained scientists. They're trained practitioners. They do basic biological science in the first 2 years, and a lot of it doesn't make them a scientist. It means they're literate about science maybe, but not scientists, right? And so what actually happened here is that those who are involved in evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine should have actually been translating what they teach into ability to actually evaluate the science itself. And it's pretty clear that didn't happen. Because if you look at that New England Journal, the first question should have been, where's the data? Where's the evidence? Should have been exactly what they asked straight away. Forget about the fact there was a New England Journal of Medicine. Somebody should have been saying, I want to see the data. I mean, journals will even ask you for data. If they have any doubt whether you're cooking the results, they'll ask you to produce it. They do it all the time. So I would say that one of the things here was that even for people like myself, actually, those who produce the science should have been paying attention to how we were educating people in science. And to understand this a little bit, you need to know something about evidence-based practice. Now, some people in the room, like Ray, are experts in this, and many of you know all about it, but if you'll forgive me, I'll repeat it. But it begins with the work of Sackett and others that actually we're trying to move medicine into a new world where what we practice would actually have some foundation. As you know, at RAND, we calculate on a good day only 20% of all medicine is evidence-based, on a good day. We think 80% even now of current medicine is not actually evidence-based. That's the best figure we can come up with. So what they wanted to do was to move that goalpost, if you like, and this is the definition, that it's the conscientious, explicit, judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about care of individual patients, and it means integrating clinical expertise with the best available clinical evidence from systematic research. And what they created, or what they compared that to first, was traditional practice, where what you would be using there was accumulated knowledge and experience, standards of quality of care, which we have guidelines which you follow, and the opinion of experts and peers. And that was what traditional medicine had been like, and now they were going to replace that with this new evidence-based stuff. And what they did is they created a hierarchy of evidence. Now, we won't go into this too much, but just to say that in actual fact, this hierarchy means that you review all the research that's been done, particularly random controlled trials, because they're the gold standard. And if you can combine them into a meta-analysis, that's the best. And I won't go into what that means, but it just means that if you've got 5 RCTs and they're homogeneous, and there's only 50 patients in each one, but you put the 5 of them together, you've now got 250 patients, you're much more likely to see adverse events, you're much more likely to calculate a good effect size. It's much better science to do that than just to have 5 separate ones, right? But they've got to be homogeneous. And then if you can't do that, at least have good RCTs. And right down the bottom, you notice the worst is the opinion of experts. So experts went from being at the top of traditional medicine to being the bottom here, right? But again, there's all kinds of different levels, but this is the one, the 2 at the top there that got the most attention. And it looks like that. Every time you see a presentation about evidence-based medicine or evidence-based practice, that's the hierarchy you're going to see. It's nice and colourful and so on. And it was supposed to transform the practice of medicine. It was supposed to move it into this new world, right? Well, Christopher Blunt, who's done his PhD at Oxford, I think, right? I think it was, wasn't it? Well, LSE, no, LSE. LSE, same as me. That's right.
Yeah.
He did this LSE. Actually, he's done a really nice piece of work looking at the philosophical assumptions under this hierarchy and pointing out that hierarchies of evidence are a very bad basis actually for making clinical decisions, because what they do is they have an assumption that average treatment effects, which are backed by high quality evidence, can justify making strong recommendations for treatment. And in an RCT, you probably know, we're actually measuring average response, right? So, and if the average is high enough, then you're going to recommend the therapy. So if in fact you're trying out a drug for diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and the average response is very good, like 70% of the people respond well, that's going to be the one you're going to recommend as being evidence-based. What about the 30% that didn't respond? We now are starting to pay attention to that 30%, partly because of the DNA. We think their DNA might be different, but non-responders have become very interesting because we're now moving to what's called individualized medicine or precision medicine. We've now figured out that this average stuff is not the way you really make a decision. When a patient's in front of you, you don't know if they're just average. You want to know, do they fall into the 30% of non-responders, right? Or were they even in the trial because the inclusion-exclusion criteria, then they had comorbidities. They never appeared in the trial at all. And if you want a telling historical example, all the original work on cardiovascular illness was done on men, not women. And as you know, women manifest cardiovascular problems different than men. And so until the NIH made a rule that you have to include women in all the cardiovascular studies, in fact, we actually based all the response pattern for treating cardiovascular events based on men. And it turns out they're wrong. Women don't manifest the symptoms the same as men do. Now we have to include them. So it's not that we didn't know this stuff, we did, right? But the hierarchies turn out to be a very bad way of really doing evidence-based medicine. And the thing that you need to think about is they're not the only ones giving evidence. The basic sciences are doing it. They're looking at the biological mechanisms and so on. The clinical trialists are doing it, and they're the ones that run these efficacy trials. People like me are doing this. Health-related quality of life is what that stands for, but we look at a whole range of things that have to do with illness and the delivery of the system. Systematic reviewers are doing evidence-based practice and evidence medicine, and the social sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, geography, all producing evidence about health, all of which is relevant to whether you make a clinical decision or not in some circumstances. And so the problem has that we've got to disconnect between research and practice. And it turns out a lot of our research, even the most rigorous, the gold standard stuff, is not that much used for practice. A lot of stuff that is good for practice is not very rigorous. So you sort of have a dilemma here, right? And if you want to know what's happened in America under Obamacare, we have a thing called PCORI, where they've actually said now we're not going to have the interests of science drive what the research is going to be. PCORI stands for Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. The Republicans like to get rid of it. They can't get their hands on it because Obama said it's such a way it's self-funding. They're giving out millions. And it will not do RCTs. It does comparative effectiveness trials, head-to-head trials against things, because it said what the patient and what the provider wants to know, which is the best therapy for me. And you get that out of comparative effectiveness trials. You don't get it out of RCTs. The drug companies will do RCTs because they'd rather compare to a placebo than a head-to-head trial against someone else's drug. Under Obama and under Obamacare, PCORI won't fund any of that. It only funds this patient-centered care now. And this is really a reflection of this position here. So if you look at the opioid crisis, and if you take what I've just said about that, we need to revisit this ethical responsibilities here. But it's a cautionary tale because it's pretty clear that if you build it, they will come, may not have occurred in evidence-based practice. During the very era where every medical doctor was trained in this paradigm, we got the opioid crisis, and it should never have occurred. Those consuming the science should have actually asked, what is the science? They were trained to do that. They could have asked how many systematic reviews are, how many RCTs are there any head-to-head trials? Nobody seemed to have asked. And yet that's the first question they should have asked, right? So then you have to say, well, clearly we didn't transform practice. We might have transformed the education system, but we certainly didn't transform practice. So the ethical challenge is, if you're a consumer of science, and I am, I teach evidence-based dentistry. So I have to decide, our students get lectures in the very first year, and we try to tell them what the evidential basis is for the practice of dentistry, which I won't share with you, but it's god-awful. But anyway, that's another story. But anyway, we teach them, right, in the first year. And so the sort of questions that people like me have to ask is, what evidence exists? How do I determine their validity? How are they relevant to practice, and how are they relevant to patients? And how can they be evaluated for the relevance of the clinical problems that you're looking at? And therefore, what should I teach? And not only that, but what should I practice if I'm a provider? So choosing evidence is therefore, from an ethical point of view, and it is an ethical choice, by the way, it always involves privileging one form of evidence over another. And what happened in evidence-based medicine is they privileged some kinds of evidence over all others. It was privileging, and sociologists will tell you that's a political act. And so, in actual fact, in this science here, which evidence should you choose? Well, interesting enough, ethics has an answer here, because we would argue that ethically your obligation both as a teacher and as a provider is to put the patient's interest first. So the evidence you should be choosing is the one that's relevant to the patient and the patient's problem that they've got. And so if you look at the principles that we teach, all providers, nurses and doctors and dentists and everyone else, these are the 6 principles, ethical principles we teach. Beneficence, that what you do has got to benefit them. Well, again, if they'd done that, if they'd looked at the data, they would have figured out this stuff was not a benefit. You're getting addicted, right? Do no harm, which is non-malfeasance. At least do no harm. It comes from the Hippocratic Oath. It's straight out of the Hippocratic Oath, actually. Veracity, you're supposed to tell the truth. You should have told people what the dangers were, and you should have told them that the effect sizes were not that good either. That would have been truth. That would have been veracity. Fidelity, keep your promises. You don't abandon patients and so on. Autonomy, there is a respect to right for patients, aside injustice. All of those 6 principles actually can be used for judging evidences. And the ethical challenge then is to determine which body of evidence you think is relevant for a particular group of patients or a particular disease system and so on. And so all I'm suggesting here is that, that the idea that evidence-based practice can be based on a single house of evidence is quite clearly a false belief. Again, that's really, it's misleading, and it's the kind of misleading thing that has got us into trouble. So privileging certain forms of evidence over others is ultimately a political act. It's not a scientific act. And also a very questionable ethical act, as it turns out. So here's what's happening. People are now going back to look at the houses of evidence. Wayne Jonas is a friend of mine, if I can go back. Oh, wrong way, I went the wrong way. And he actually says that it's a house with many rooms. So there's the guys that do the evidence-based practice stuff. They've got one room, right? Here's epidemiology and health services. I've got this. And laboratory researchers. He says this is a house with many rooms. It's a bit like the quote from the Bible. My Father's home has many rooms of war, so I would tell you, which always gets quoted at funerals, I think. But anyway, this is what he says. It's not as if it's going to be a house of evidence, it's a house with many rooms, and you need to be literate. It doesn't mean you have to be one of the researchers. It just means you have to be literate. By the way, that's no different than what we do with basic sciences. We make every medical student and nurse and so on and dentist do 2 years of basic science the first 2 years. Huge amount of anatomy, physiology, neurology. We're just making them literate. We're not making them neurologists. We're not making them scientists. They don't come out of that being a scientist. They just come out being literate about the basic sciences. So this is no different than what I'm suggesting here. We already do it. And then a friend of mine, Harold Wallach, who's in Germany, he wants to build a totally different house. And the one from New Zealand, which is quite interesting actually, is Philip Cottingham, who is a naturopath, I think. He actually has got this nice one where he looks at traditional practices, he looks at research findings, and he looks at clinical. So he's got 3 houses, and I guess the sweet spot is where they share the kitchen, I guess. But anyway, you can see that there are different houses of evidence, and in actual fact, ethically, you should consider them all. The idea that one of them works and the rest don't. So, to sum up, I would say that all health faculty, science faculty who teach like I do need to be literate in a fairly wide range of research methods now, and at least must know something about the houses of evidence. We need to train the providers in those houses of evidence. They need to know that they have an ethical responsibility to make sure that the science they're drawing on actually is legitimate and is pertinent to the problems they're trying to solve, and they wouldn't be giving out the oxycodone the way they did. It may actually be a condition for being employed in health science. By the way, it is a condition for being a researcher in the United States. We have what's called a city certificate. Every single researcher to get a grant from NIH must have a certificate to show that you're trained and examined in ethics, right? I have 5, partly because UCLA has one, RAND has one, and then the Army has got one, the Navy's got one, and the Air Force has got one. And in America, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force don't talk to each other, so you've got to do 3. They won't share them, so I've got 5 of them, and I think every 2 years I have to renew it. I got a notice the other day, it's 2 years, which is really good. So I'm not suggesting something that's outrageous here.
Right, it's a free course. Anybody in the world.
Free course, yeah.
Yes.
The city is actually run by a university. I can't remember which one, and all the universities agreed to use it now. We used to have had our own, but now it's called CITI, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for. It's something like institutional shared something. Anyway, I think it's in my.
It's a requirement.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, there it is. There. Yeah. Collaborative institutional training. Yeah, that's.
I think in the States it's a requirement for a PhD candidate to pass the city.
It would be
before data collection.
You wouldn't be allowed to do a thesis in America, and they should pass it as well. So I'm not actually suggesting something that's really right. But anyway, just to conclude. My great quote from the working class. Now you talk like a reasonable child. I meant by impenetrability that we've had enough of that subject. It'd be just as well if you mention what you intend to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life. And I suppose that's true for me too. And this one here, I don't think Sir David Lowe actually came from Timaru, but he could have. He's smart enough to come from Timaru. But he's my favourite cartoonist, and I think it's a really nice comment because we thought we had reformed medicine and nursing and dentistry and all these things. It turns out, I love the quote, Gadster, reforms are all right as long as they don't change anything. And it looks like with the opioid crisis, we didn't change very much. Thank you.
Well, are there any questions of Ian?
Can I ask?
Yeah.
It's partly a question, but partly an observation, because I am one of the members in the House who learned medicine during the sort of heydays of evidence-based practice. I did some of the same things that you have showed over here, practiced and prescribed oxycodones. But one of the reasons why that got prescribed quite a lot was also because of the anesthetists, because they found that for general anesthesia, for pain relief, it was a rather effective drug, better than the other opioids and better than tramadol afterwards. So when we examine those statistics, I think it's a good idea to segregate non-cancer applications, cancerous application, orthopedic applications, and then you'll see how the trajectory pans out. And I take your point that there was this non-understanding of that. But partly also because 1980, when they came out with that report, evidence-based medicine was nowhere near there. So
that's right.
We are.
The funny thing is, though, they kept quoting it, though. It's been quoted over and over again. Even if it came out in the 90s, evidence-based medicine was around, for sure. But it came out in the 80s, but if you look at that, I've actually tracked the number of times it's quoted. And it's one of the most quoted. The two scientists have sort of apologized in a very measly kind of way since, actually. But, they don't take full responsibility, but they've kind of said, oh, we're sorry. But,
The question that I had for you is the problem with the precision medicine is that we don't really have enough genomic information other than for the whites. We have some for for a Caucasian population, but for the African Americans, for the Chinese, for the Indians, for a whole host of people who don't have. Even then, we have issues with Mendelian randomization that can address some of these.
A really good question, because precision medicine and genomic medicine are going to have a huge confrontation, because what might happen is that they use genomic medicine for victim blaming. So you've got 30% of people, let's say they turn out to be some ethnic group who don't respond, they'll say, well, it's because of their DNA. So I can see there's going to be a huge confrontation here about how to resolve that. One group thinks it's all going to be in the DNA and it's going to be genomic medicine. There's another group like myself think, in actual fact, that's diverting some of the best brains in medicine away from what they should have looked at, was the biopsychosocial paradigm, which had just started to really, it certainly is the educational paradigm that's taught. Every medical doctor in America has taught Ingalls' paradigm, right? And just at the time when Ingalls' paradigm was starting to make sense and make sure that you would look at all those factors together, along comes genomic medicine, and it's highly reductionistic, and a lot of the medical profession have seen it as the savior for preventive medicine. And unfortunately, as I said, the best brains in medicine are doing cell biology and stuff. Hardly anyone does general biology more. They're not doing whole systems. And in actual fact, if you look at it, it's probably going to be